A broken German shepherd, abandoned and betrayed, waits in a shelter for someone to believe in him again. When a familiar face appears after years of separation, he can't control the flood of emotions. Will the bond they once shared survive, or has time torn them apart forever? This is the heart-wrenching story of love, healing, and second chances. Before we move on, if you're an animal lover, tap subscribe. It's completely free, and every click inspires us to keep sharing the stories that truly touch the heart and give a voice to those who can't speak for themselves. The cold morning air hung heavy as the shelter gates opened, revealing the familiar sight of wagging tails and excited barks. The volunteers moved quickly, leading the dogs out into the yard for their morning walk, but one dog remained still. A German shepherd, his fur matted with the remnants of yesterday's rain, sat quietly in the far corner, staring blankly at the ground. His name was Atlas. Atlas had been here for what seemed like forever, though the shelter staff could never quite remember exactly when he'd arrived. Weeks? Months? No one knew for sure. He didn't chase balls, didn't bark for attention, and he never seemed to want to play with the other dogs. In fact, he didn't seem to want anything at all. His eyes, once full of life, were now dull and distant. It was as if he had given up on ever being chosen, ever being loved. Every time a visitor walked by his kennel, he would lift his head, his eyes filled with a brief spark of hope, but then he would lower his gaze again, as if he already knew that hope would be crushed. One by one, the other dogs left the shelter, found new homes, new families. But not Atlas. People said he was too big, too quiet, too broken. The other volunteers would shrug, mutter that maybe he was better off staying in the shelter. At least he was safe here. But no one knew the real story of Atlas. No one knew the pain he carried with him, the loss that had driven him to this point. 2 days later, a man walked through the door. His clothes were worn, his face lined with age and regret. He had the look of someone who had seen too much of the world's darkness and was searching desperately for a flicker of light. He paused at the counter, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his wallet. The shelter worker behind the desk, a young woman named Emily, glanced up. She noticed the way his eyes darted nervously around the room, as if he was looking for something or someone. "Can I help you?" Emily asked, her voice soft. The man took a breath, his eyes lowering. "I'm looking for a German shepherd. His name's Atlas." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had worked at the shelter for over a year, and in all that time, she had never seen anyone ask for Atlas by name. His story, or lack thereof, was well known around the shelter. His name had become synonymous with long stays and lost causes. But this man, he had been looking for him. She nodded slowly. "We have an Atlas here. But I should warn you, he's been here for a while. He's not like the other dogs." She gave him a quick look, but the man didn't seem deterred. If anything, his gaze hardened, a quiet determination settling in his eyes. "Can I see him?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Emily led him to the back, where Atlas lay curled up in his corner, barely acknowledging their presence. His coat was thick, but his eyes, those eyes, were clouded, his face sunken. The man stopped at the edge of the kennel. His breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight of the dog he had once known, once loved, and once had to leave behind. "Atlas," the man whispered. Atlas's ears twitched. Slowly, as if his body had forgotten the act, he lifted his head. His gaze met the man's, and in that instant, everything changed. The world around them seemed to fade into nothingness. There were no barking dogs, no busy shelter workers, no ticking clocks. Just the man and the dog, locked in a moment frozen in time. Atlas's eyes widened, the dullness vanishing for a heartbeat, replaced by recognition. His body trembled, his legs weak. The once stoic dog stood, his paws unsteady on the floor, as if his muscles had forgotten how to move. Then, with a desperate cry, Atlas collapsed to the ground, his body racked with sobs. The sound was not one of fear or anger. It was a cry of recognition, of a memory breaking free after years of silence. The man fell to his knees, his heart shattering as he reached for the dog. "I'm here, Atlas. I'm here. I never should have left you." Emily stood frozen in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. She had seen many things in her time at the shelter, but this was different. This wasn't just a reunion. It was a moment of pure emotion, a flood of memories, pain, and love rushing back into a broken heart. The man gently pulled Atlas into his arms, cradling him like a lost child. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he whispered through his tears. "I'm so sorry for leaving you." Atlas whimpered, nuzzling the man's chest as if trying to get closer, to make sure he wasn't dreaming. The shelter workers, the other dogs, everything was forgotten. All that mattered in that moment was the two of them, reunited after all this time. Emily could feel her own tears welling up as she watched. She had always known that some animals carried scars deeper than anyone could see. But this was something beyond the physical. This was a bond that had been broken but was now healing, piece by piece. No one knew what had happened to Atlas all those months in the shelter. No one knew the true story behind his broken spirit. But one thing was clear: the man in front of him. He was the key to the healing. The man was not just his past, he was Atlas's future. But as the man held Atlas in his arms, the question loomed: could the bond ever be fully repaired? Could a broken heart ever truly heal? And what had happened to rip them apart in the first place? As they knelt together on the cold concrete floor of the shelter, neither the man nor the dog had the answers. But they didn't need to, because they had each other again. And that was all that mattered. 2 years ago, the world had felt different for the man, whose name was Daniel. At the time, his life had been full of joy and purpose. He had been younger, more carefree, with dreams that stretched out like an endless horizon. Daniel and Atlas had been inseparable. A quiet, unspoken bond had formed between them from the moment they met. Atlas wasn't just a dog. He was a companion, a confidant, a protector. There was a special understanding between them, a trust that had grown stronger with every passing day. They had shared mornings in the park, evenings on the couch, and nights by the fire. When Daniel went on long hikes through the nearby woods, Atlas was always by his side, his strong frame effortlessly keeping pace with Daniel's every step. But life, as it often does, had a way of changing things. And for Daniel, it all came crashing down on an early winter morning. It was the kind of day where the sky hung low and gray, and the chill in the air cut through the thickest of jackets. Daniel had received a call from his company, the one he had worked for, tirelessly and without rest, for the past 5 years. The words downsizing and budget cuts had never hit him harder. Within a week, Daniel was without a job. The bills piled up quickly, faster than he could handle. And despite his best efforts to remain positive, the reality of his situation was undeniable. His apartment was too expensive to keep without an income. The dream of stability, once so close, was slipping from his grasp. Atlas, ever loyal, stayed close by his side, sensing the change in the air. He would watch Daniel pace, his eyes filled with concern, but his faith in Daniel never wavered. There was an unspoken promise between them. No matter how bad things got, they would always have each other. But life doesn't always wait for you to get back on your feet. One cold afternoon, the engine of Daniel's old truck sputtered and died on the side of the highway. A blown head gasket. The repairs were too costly. He had no money left. There was no way to get it fixed. Daniel sat in the driver's seat, staring blankly at the steering wheel. He couldn't bear to look at Atlas, sitting in the passenger seat, staring out the window, unaware of the reality that was slowly creeping in. Atlas, his loyal companion, his best friend, was watching him, trusting him to make it all right. But Daniel couldn't fix it. He couldn't fix his life, and he certainly couldn't fix the broken heart he felt growing inside him. With nowhere to go, Daniel made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He drove Atlas to the local shelter, a place Daniel had always hoped never to see. The moment he opened the door, the smell of disinfectant and old cages hit him, but it wasn't the smell that broke him. It was the look in Atlas's eyes. Atlas had always been calm, always trusting, but today, there was something different. Atlas didn't bark or growl or whine. He simply sat there, confused, as Daniel handed over the leash to the shelter worker. "I'm so sorry, buddy," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. I can't do this anymore. I don't have anything left to give you." The shelter worker didn't say anything. He just took the leash and led Atlas into the building, the German Shepherd's confused eyes following Daniel until he disappeared behind the door. Daniel didn't stay to watch. He couldn't. That night, Daniel parked his truck in a motel lot, not knowing what his next step was, not knowing how to move forward. His heart was shattered into a million pieces. The guilt, the shame, they ate away at him. He tried to sleep, but the cold from the outside world seeped into his bones, a reminder that he had failed Atlas. He had failed the one being who had never once left his side. The tears came, silent and heavy. He cried not just for what he had lost, but for what he had done. Back at the shelter, Atlas spent his days in a quiet corner. He didn't bark or beg for attention. He simply waited. Every day, he watched the people walk past his cage, his eyes lighting up for a moment when someone would stop, but when they moved on, his gaze would drop again, his body sagging in defeat. He had been abandoned. He had been left behind. And no one had told him why. Weeks turned into months. Atlas's spirit seemed to dim with each passing day. He was a dog with no hope, no trust, and no one who cared enough to look beyond his silence. And yet, despite everything, his heart still waited. Daniel, meanwhile, continued to struggle. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. He found odd jobs here and there, just enough to pay for a roof over his head and food in his stomach. But nothing filled the empty space inside him, the space that had once been occupied by Atlas. Then, one day, on a whim, no, a prayer, Daniel searched the local shelters online, hoping, wishing, that maybe, just maybe, Atlas was still there. And there he was. Atlas, older now, thinner. The same scar above his right eye. The same sad eyes. Daniel's hands trembled as he called the shelter. They confirmed that Atlas was still there. Still waiting. 2 years of separation. 2 years of heartache. But now, Daniel was ready. Ready to make things right. Ready to bring Atlas home. He could feel the weight of the past on his shoulders, the burden of the mistakes he had made. But he knew that this was the only chance he had left to heal what had been broken. And so, with that quiet hope rekindled, he stood in the shelter, looking at Atlas for the first time in what felt like forever. But even though Atlas seemed to recognize him, there was still a question that hung in the air like a fragile thread. Could the bond ever truly be healed? Would Atlas ever forgive him? And as Atlas stood, trembling before him, the answer was clear. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about creating a future, one where love, trust, and second chances could bloom once more. The shelter's walls seemed to close in as Daniel stood there, staring at Atlas, his heart pounding in his chest. The German Shepherd was standing, his body trembling with emotion. His eyes locked onto Daniel's, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. It wasn't a look of confusion, nor one of anger. It was a mixture of disbelief, hope, and something deeper, a yearning that had been dormant for far too long. Atlas's ears twitched as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Was this really happening? Was the man he had waited for, prayed for, finally standing in front of him again? Atlas, Daniel's voice cracked, barely a whisper, filled with all the regret he had carried for so long. Atlas's head tilted, and for a brief, fleeting second, Daniel saw a spark, a glimmer of recognition. The bond, though worn thin with time, was still there. The memories were still alive in the dog's heart. And then, without warning, Atlas's legs buckled. His body crumpled to the floor in a wave of raw emotion. He was no longer standing. His chest heaved as his entire body trembled, and he let out a heart-wrenching whine, the sound of a dog whose heart had been broken and now, after all this time, was being mended. Daniel rushed to him, dropping to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached out to his old friend. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. "I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know how to fix things." For a moment, the shelter felt empty. All the noise of the other dogs, the hustle of the workers, seemed to fade into a distant hum. It was just Daniel and Atlas, two souls that had been separated by life's cruelty, but who had found their way back to each other, despite everything. Atlas's body trembled, his eyes filled with so many emotions that Daniel couldn't even begin to name them. The dog's chest rose and fell rapidly, but he didn't resist. Instead, he slowly crawled forward, dragging his legs with effort. His nose pressed against Daniel's chest, and for the first time in 2 years, Daniel felt the familiar weight of Atlas's head resting on him. Daniel wrapped his arms around the German Shepherd, pulling him close. He felt the tremors in Atlas's body, the deep, unspoken pain that had festered inside him for so long. This wasn't just a reunion. It wasn't just a simple moment of joy. This was an ocean of feelings crashing against them both. "I never stopped loving you, buddy," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't deserve you. I thought I was doing what was best. I was wrong. I was so wrong." The shelter workers stood frozen, watching the scene unfold before them. Some wiped away tears. Others held their breath, not knowing how to respond to the overwhelming wave of emotion in the room. They had never seen Atlas like this before. He had been a shell of a dog when he had first arrived, quiet, withdrawn, broken. But now, in this moment, it was clear this was the dog's chance for healing. This was a reunion that could change everything. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Daniel held Atlas, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure how long they sat there, but time felt irrelevant. All that mattered was this: the man who had failed his dog, and the dog who had never given up on him. When Daniel finally pulled back, he wiped the tears from his eyes. "Can you forgive me, Atlas? I can't promise I'll always get it right, but I promise I'll try. I'll spend every day making it up to you." Atlas lifted his head and looked up at Daniel. There were no words, no barks, no growls. Just a silent, soul-deep connection that spoke louder than any language could. Slowly, Atlas licked Daniel's face, the first sign of affection he had shown in so long. It was a tentative gesture, but it was enough. Daniel's chest tightened with emotion. "You still love me," he whispered, more to himself than to Atlas. "You still love me." And that was all that mattered. The paperwork was quick. The shelter manager stood beside Daniel, silently watching as he filled out the adoption forms. She could see the weight of the past hanging over him, but she also saw the love in his eyes, the love that had never truly faded. She could see that Atlas was the key to Daniel's redemption, just as much as Daniel was the key to Atlas's healing. As Daniel signed the last line, he glanced down at Atlas, who was still sitting beside him, his head tilted in curiosity. "Let's go home, boy," Daniel said softly, his voice thick with emotion. It wasn't a grand home, but it was a home. A home that had space for forgiveness, for second chances, and for love. A home that could heal both of them. The shelter staff smiled quietly as they watched Daniel clip the leash back onto Atlas's collar, the same collar he had once handed over in a moment of desperation. They had seen countless dogs come and go from their care, but this moment felt different. This wasn't just about adoption. It was about redemption. About two hearts finding their way back to each other, against all odds. As they stepped outside into the cool air, Atlas paused at the threshold of the shelter, his body stiff. He turned back, his eyes lingering on the building that had been his home for the past year. It wasn't just a shelter to him. It had been his prison, the place where he had waited in vain. And yet, as Atlas stood there, Daniel felt a deep understanding pass between them. Atlas wasn't saying goodbye. He was simply acknowledging that the past had been hard, but now, they were ready to move forward. They were ready to begin a new chapter. The drive home was quiet, but the silence was comforting. Atlas lay in the back seat, his head resting against the window, watching the world pass by. Daniel kept glancing back at him, making sure this wasn't just a dream. When they pulled up to Daniel's small apartment, Atlas hesitated, sniffing the air. It wasn't the house by the river, the home they had once shared. It wasn't the perfect place, but it was theirs. The apartment was small, but as Daniel opened the door and stepped inside, there was a quiet sense of promise in the air. It wasn't the life he had once imagined for himself and Atlas. It wasn't the house with the large backyard or the riverbank where they had spent so many happy days. But it was real. It was now. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a sense of hope blooming deep inside his chest. "Come on, boy," Daniel said softly, holding the door open wider for Atlas. "Home. It's our home now." Atlas hesitated for a moment before slowly stepping inside. His paws clicked softly on the hardwood floors as he sniffed the air, taking in his new surroundings. The apartment smelled of old wood and the faint scent of pine, and there was a small patch of sunlight streaming through the window, warming the room with its golden glow. Daniel had set up a bed for Atlas in the corner, a new cushion placed beside the couch. The space was small, but it was comfortable, enough room for them both. Daniel's heart swelled as he watched Atlas approach the bed, his large frame tentative, unsure. Atlas walked around the cushion once, then twice, his body stiff, his movements cautious. He wasn't sure if this was real, if this was where he was meant to be. He had spent so much time in limbo, trapped in his memories, in his loneliness. But now, this new space, this new beginning, it felt unfamiliar, even after everything they had been through. Daniel crouched down beside him, his voice soft. "I know, buddy. It's different. But it's safe. It's ours." Atlas turned his head slowly and looked at Daniel, his eyes a mixture of confusion and trust. There was a wariness in his gaze, but there was something else, too. A flicker of hope, a tiny ember of belief that maybe, just maybe, this time things could be different. The sound of Daniel's voice seemed to soothe him, and after a few moments, Atlas finally lowered himself onto the bed. He sighed, a deep, contented sigh, as his body relaxed for the first time since they had reunited. Daniel sat down next to him, gently resting his hand on Atlas's head. "You remember when we used to lay on the couch together, don't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "When we used to watch the world go by, just the two of us." Atlas didn't respond, but he didn't have to. His eyes, half closed now, were the answer Daniel needed. The memories were still there, the joy, the comfort, the bond that had once seemed unbreakable. They had lost it, but now they were starting to rebuild. It was slow. It would take time. But the pieces were starting to come together. That night, as the city hummed quietly outside, Daniel lay on the couch, his arms stretched out across Atlas's body. The dog was curled up beside him, his head resting on Daniel's chest, his body still but warm. The clock ticked on the wall, but for Daniel, it felt like the world had stopped. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was comforting, even peaceful. He could feel Atlas's breath, steady and slow, matching the rhythm of his own heart. "You're safe now," Daniel whispered. "I promise I'll never leave you again. I've learned that I can't keep running. I can't keep hiding from the things that matter. And you matter, Atlas. You always have." Atlas lifted his head slightly, as if listening. He didn't make a sound, but his eyes, they were full of understanding. He had been through so much, and yet, here they were. Together. It wasn't the life Daniel had imagined, but it was a life they would build together. Slowly, day by day, they would heal. And that, for now, was enough. The next morning, the sun poured through the window, bathing the room in soft light. Atlas was already awake, his eyes focused on the door, as if waiting for something to happen. Daniel stretched, yawning, and looked down at his dog. "Good morning, boy," he said with a smile, reaching down to scratch behind Atlas's ears. The dog's tail gave a gentle wag, and Daniel chuckled softly. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Atlas was beginning to trust him again. Today, they would go for a walk. The streets outside were bustling, but Daniel didn't mind. The world seemed brighter now, more full of promise. And as they left the apartment together, Daniel could feel the bond between them growing stronger with each step. The walk was slow, deliberate. Atlas took his time, sniffing the trees, the grass, the unfamiliar scents of the city. At first, he kept his head low, cautious, unsure of the people and the other dogs around them. But Daniel was patient, his voice calm, guiding him every step of the way. As they passed a park, Atlas stopped for a moment, his ears pricking up as he watched a group of children playing. They were laughing, chasing each other, their feet pounding against the grass. For a moment, Atlas froze. His tail was still, his body tense. The memories of his past, of the home they had once shared, of the good days, seemed to rush back. Daniel stopped too, standing beside him, letting him take it all in. "It's okay," he murmured. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Slowly, Atlas's body relaxed. His tail twitched, just once. The tension in his muscles seemed to fade as he turned his attention back to Daniel. And in that moment, it felt like a small victory, one step closer to healing. Later that evening, Daniel sat in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Atlas sat by the door, watching him with those familiar, loyal eyes. It was the first time in a long time that Daniel felt at peace. The pain of the past still lingered, but now, it was more of a reminder of how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. Atlas didn't bark. He didn't demand attention. He simply watched, waiting for the next moment. And Daniel, for the first time in years, was ready to give it to him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be struggles, setbacks, and more challenges. But as Daniel watched Atlas, his body slowly healing, his spirit slowly mending, he knew one thing for certain. They were in this together. They were healing together. And that was all that mattered. The days blurred together in a way that felt comforting. Each one was another layer of healing, another step forward. Daniel and Atlas settled into their rhythm, their bond strengthening with every passing moment. It was a quiet, steady peace that filled their home now, a peace that had been so long absent from both their lives. Every morning, Daniel would wake up early, stretching his arms above his head as sunlight filtered through the blinds. Atlas was always there, curled up beside him, his body warm and solid against Daniel's side. Some days, the dog would rest his head on Daniel's chest, and Daniel would stroke his fur, feeling the beat of his heart, steady and sure. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of anxiety, of pain. Atlas still flinched at sudden movements, especially when Daniel's hand came too quickly toward his head. His eyes would widen, and his body would tense up in fear. But the more time passed, the less those moments occurred. Slowly, Daniel's gentle approach, his calm voice, and his unwavering presence began to ease the dog's trauma. "Easy, boy," Daniel would whisper whenever Atlas flinched. "You're safe. I won't hurt you." And slowly, step by step, Atlas began to believe it. One Saturday morning, Daniel decided to take Atlas to the local park again. He knew it was time to push forward, to test the waters. They had been walking the same quiet streets, the same safe paths, for weeks now. But the park was a different world, bustling with children, other dogs, and families. It was bigger, louder, and a little overwhelming. But it was also where Atlas needed to be. Daniel reached for the leash, his hands steady. "Ready, buddy?" he asked, his voice calm, gentle. Atlas looked up at him, eyes wide, hesitant, but trusting. Daniel clipped the leash to the collar and opened the door, letting Atlas take the lead as they stepped outside. The park was just a short walk from their apartment. The sound of children's laughter filled the air, along with the distant chirps of birds and the rustling of trees in the breeze. Atlas slowed his pace as they neared the entrance, his ears flattening against his head. His body was tense, his movements hesitant. "Hey, it's okay," Daniel reassured him, bending down to the dog's level. He gently placed a hand on Atlas's back, feeling the dog's muscles tight beneath his fur. "We'll take it slow, all right? No rush." They walked in slowly, taking in the sights and sounds around them. Atlas stayed close, occasionally glancing up at Daniel as if asking for reassurance. "Look, buddy," Daniel said softly, pointing to the other dogs running in the distance. "They're just like you. They're here to play." Atlas's gaze followed Daniel's hand, watching a golden retriever and a labradoodle chase each other near the swings. The sight of them, happy and carefree, made Atlas take a small step forward. He sniffed the air, his tail twitching, and for the first time, Daniel saw the smallest hint of interest. They moved further into the park, Atlas still cautious but more curious now. They passed a few benches, and Daniel's eyes flicked to one where an older man sat, watching the scene unfold. The man's gaze landed on Atlas, and his expression softened. Well, the man muttered, a twinkle in his eyes. "You've got a good one there." Daniel smiled, nodding in thanks. "He's been through a lot," he said quietly, "but he's getting better." The man smiled back, his voice warm. "Dogs like that don't forget loyalty. He'll get there. Just give him time." As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Daniel and Atlas made their way to a quiet corner near the pond. There were fewer people here now, and the sound of the water lapping gently against the shore was calming. Daniel sat on the grass, his legs stretched out in front of him. He patted the ground beside him. "Come on, Atlas. Come sit." Atlas hesitated at first, his eyes darting around as if making sure it was safe. But after a few moments, he took a tentative step forward, his large paws barely making a sound on the soft grass. Slowly, he lowered himself down beside Daniel, his head resting on the ground as he sat with his back against his side. Daniel smiled softly, his heart swelling. This was progress. They were sharing a peaceful moment together, just as they had before, just like old times. The park, the pond, the quiet, it all felt like the beginning of something new. A new chapter. That night, after their walk, Daniel and Atlas returned home, both tired but content. The apartment felt more like a home now. It was no longer just a place they slept. It was their sanctuary. The space was filled with the little touches that Daniel had added to make it theirs: a soft rug in the living room, a few photos of the two of them together, a fresh coat of paint on the walls. Daniel sat down on the couch and patted the seat beside him. "Come on, buddy. Let's get some rest. Big day tomorrow." Atlas climbed up beside him, curling up at his feet as Daniel grabbed the remote to turn on the TV. They didn't need to watch it. It was the sound of the world outside, a comforting hum in the background as they sat in the silence of their little apartment, together. It wasn't the life they had imagined, not the grand picture Daniel had once dreamed of, but it was real, and it was theirs. They were healing. The weeks went by, each one a new step in their journey. The trust that had been broken was slowly being rebuilt, piece by piece. It was hard work. Some days, Atlas would retreat into himself, his body language tight, his eyes distant. Other days, he would lean into Daniel's touch, his tail wagging in the soft glow of the evening light. But through every setback, there was progress. And Daniel was there, every step of the way, offering patience, love, and the promise that Atlas would never have to face the world alone again. And when Atlas would curl up beside him at night, his body warm and solid against Daniel's side, Daniel would whisper, "We're in this together, buddy." Always. The early mornings had become a part of their routine, and with each sunrise, Daniel and Atlas grew closer. The apartment that once felt like a temporary place to sleep now felt like their home, a space where healing happened, where trust was built, and where love began to bloom in small, steady moments. Atlas's presence was a constant reminder that no matter how broken they both had been, they were still capable of mending the pieces. Daniel had noticed the change in Atlas. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't without its setbacks, but there was a softness in the dog's eyes now, a quiet reassurance that he was starting to feel safe. His ears perked when he heard Daniel's voice, and he would wag his tail more often, sometimes even before Daniel had moved toward him. It was like Atlas had learned that not all hands were meant to hurt him, not all words were filled with anger. One morning, as the sun streamed through the window and bathed the apartment in warm light, Daniel found Atlas sitting at the door, his body tense, but his gaze focused and intent. "Hey, boy," Daniel murmured, kneeling down to Atlas's level. "What's going on? You want to go for a walk?" Atlas's ears perked up, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't hesitate. His tail wagged softly, and he took a step forward, nudging Daniel's hand with his nose as if to say, "I'm ready." Daniel smiled, his heart swelling. They had been through so much, and now, here they were, moving forward, together. "All right, let's do this," Daniel said softly. He clipped the leash to Atlas's collar, and the two of them headed out the door. The walk was different that morning. The air was crisp, and the sounds of the city felt distant, muted by the quiet calm of their bond. As they walked through the streets, Daniel couldn't help but notice how Atlas's gait was more confident, how he wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder as he had in the past. He was walking beside Daniel, head held high, as if he too had come to believe that the world could be a safe place. They walked through the park again, but this time, it was different. There were children running past, their laughter ringing in the air, but Atlas didn't flinch. Instead, he looked around, his tail slowly wagging as he watched a few dogs play fetch. He was more relaxed now, more engaged with the world around him, and Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It wasn't just Atlas who had healed. Daniel had too. They sat by the pond once again, just as they had that day weeks ago. The sound of the water flowing gently filled the silence between them. Atlas laid down beside Daniel, resting his head on his paws, his body relaxed. For the first time in a long while, there was no tension between them, no fear, no hesitation. There was just peace. "You know," Daniel said softly, glancing down at Atlas, "I didn't think I'd ever get this chance. To be here with you, to get to know you again. I thought I lost it all." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "But we're here. Together." Atlas turned his head to look up at him, his eyes steady and trusting. It was a look Daniel knew well now, the look of a dog who had learned to forgive, to heal, and to love again. Later that afternoon, as they walked home from the park, Daniel felt the weight of the past months lift off his shoulders. There had been so many moments of doubt, so many days when he questioned whether they would make it. But here they were, walking side by side, both of them stronger than before. As they approached their apartment, Daniel noticed something small but significant. Atlas had stopped looking over his shoulder every few steps. He wasn't constantly scanning his surroundings for threats. He was walking with his head held high, his eyes forward. It wasn't just that he had learned to trust Daniel. He had learned to trust himself, to believe that he was safe. "Good boy," Daniel whispered, bending down to give Atlas a gentle pat. "You've come so far." The apartment door opened, and Atlas stepped inside without hesitation, tail wagging as he moved into the familiar space. He was home. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like they both were. The next few weeks were filled with small milestones, little moments of progress that meant the world to both of them. Atlas began to seek out affection more often, nudging Daniel's hand for pets, and even curling up beside him on the couch at night. It wasn't just that he was healing. He was starting to believe that he was worthy of love, of care. One evening, as Daniel sat at the kitchen table eating dinner, Atlas approached him, his eyes soft and expectant. "You hungry, buddy?" Daniel asked, laughing softly as he pushed his plate aside. He stood and went to the pantry, pulling out a can of food for Atlas. As he opened the can, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the simplicity of the moment. "Here you go," Daniel said, placing the bowl down in front of Atlas. The dog immediately dug in, his tail wagging in contentment. Daniel sat down at the table, watching him. The room was quiet except for the sound of Atlas eating, the soft hum of the refrigerator, and the distant rustle of trees outside. This was what life was about. It wasn't grand gestures or monumental changes. It was the quiet, everyday moments that made the difference. One afternoon, a few months later, Daniel found himself sitting at the same park bench where they had spent so many afternoons together. Atlas sat beside him, his head resting on Daniel's knee as they both watched the world go by. It was peaceful here, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt like he belonged. The sound of a child's laughter echoed across the park, and Atlas perked up, his ears twitching. Daniel looked down at him, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We've come a long way, haven't we, buddy?" Atlas gave a soft bark in response, as if agreeing with him. The bond they shared had transformed them both, and it was something Daniel knew would never be broken again. There was still more to face, more to heal from. But for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt hopeful. And he knew, deep down, that no matter what came next, he would always have Atlas by his side. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, Atlas curled up at his feet, Daniel closed his eyes, the weight of the day settling into peaceful sleep. For the first time in a long while, he didn't dream of the past. He dreamed of the future, of all the adventures still ahead, of the love and loyalty that would continue to grow between them. And as he drifted off to sleep, he whispered, "We're going to be okay, Atlas. We're going to be okay."